The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not via radio signal, not through the slow crawl of light across the void. It materialized directly inside the secure servers of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, bypassing every firewall, every encryption layer, every defense humanity had spent decades building. It was 11 words in perfect English, translated, the metadata later revealed, from a language 4,000 years older than written Chinese. You have been observed. Attend the conclave session or be classified. No coordinates, no explanation of what classified meant, just the quiet arrogance of something that had never needed to explain itself. Ambassador Yara Osai was in The Hague when she received the summons, sitting across a courtroom table from a defense attorney who was arguing, with a straight face, that his client's militias hadn't known the villages were inhabited. She had been a war crimes prosecutor for 19 years before the diplomatic corps recruited her. She had sat in rooms with men who ordered massacres and watched them adjust their cuffs. She knew the particular smell of power that believed itself untouchable. She read the 11 words twice. Then she closed her laptop, dismissed the recess, and quietly began preparing to leave the planet. The ship they sent for her was not human-built. It appeared in low orbit over the Atlantic 3 days after the message. A vessel the size of a stadium, its hull the color of deep water, silent in a way that made the ISS cameras feel intrusive just for watching. No weapons visible, no aggression, just the effortless presence of something that had traveled between stars the way humans drove to work. Inside, the envoy was waiting. It called itself Counselor Emissary Vane of the Tharic delegation, and it resembled, loosely, a very tall person made of braided copper wire and patience. It welcomed Yara aboard with the formal courtesy of something that had done this many times before with many species, and it explained the galactic conclave in the tone of a landlord explaining house rules to a new tenant. 43 spacefaring civilizations, 11,000 years of continuous governance, a tiered chamber at the orbital station above the gas giant Vela Mara, where all matters of interstellar law were debated, voted upon, and settled. Humanity had achieved FTL travel ahead of any projection, a full century earlier than the models suggested was probable, and that made Earth, in the conclave's terms, a situation requiring management. Management, Yara repeated. Integration, Vane corrected pleasantly. She spent the 3-week transit reading. Vane provided her with an archive of conclave proceedings, thousands of years of session transcripts, rulings, resolutions, and ratified agreements. She read through the night cycles while the stars outside stretched and blurred, taking notes in the margins of digital pages the way she used to annotate case files. She was looking for the shape of the thing. Every institution has one, the hidden grammar beneath the formal language, the place where the rules bend toward whoever wrote them. She found it. The conclave's founding charter guaranteed every member species equal standing in principle, but voting weight was adjusted by a civilizational longevity index. Effectively, the older you were, the more your vote counted. New species spent their first decades in observer-tier seats, technically present, practically voiceless. They were expected to watch, absorb the norms, and learn when silence was appropriate. The older species had been teaching that lesson for a very long time. The station came into view on day 22, a structure so vast it had its own weather systems, its own gravitational pull detectable by human instruments. Thousands of ships docked along its arms like ornaments. Hundreds of civilizations, reduced to delegations, filing through corridors toward a room where the galaxy's decisions were made. Yara Os docked her ship, straightened her coat, and walked in with the calm of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do. She just needed to see who she was doing it to. The chamber was designed to make you feel small. That was Yara's first and most certain observation, not a paranoid one, not a projection, but a professional assessment formed from 2 decades of watching architecture used as a weapon. The conclave's great hall rose 200 meters from floor to ceiling, ringed with concentric tiers of delegate seats that curved upward in a perfect bowl. The inner ring, closest to the central dais, held perhaps a dozen delegations. Their seats were carved from something that looked like obsidian, fitted with translation systems so seamlessly embedded they were invisible. The lighting warmed as it reached the center, gold and amber near the inner ring, fading to cold blue-white at the outer tiers. Humanity's assigned seat was outer tier, row 7, section 41. The placard read, Earth Observer Status Non-Binding Participation. The delegate to Yara's left was from a species called the Murath, a small, gray-furred people with large dark eyes who had achieved FTL roughly 30 years prior and had clearly already learned what the outer tier meant. Their lead diplomat, a woman whose name translated roughly as speak carefully, leaned over when she saw Yara studying the inner ring. "Don't stare at them directly," she said quietly. "It's considered presumptuous from this tier." "Presumptuous," Yara said. "They find it uncomfortable, young species looking at them with expectations." Yara looked anyway. The inner ring delegations were old, not just old in the civilizational sense, though the Tharic, the conclave's founders, were said to be 12,000 years into spaceflight, but old in the way of things that have not been surprised in a long time. They moved with the ease of permanent residents. They greeted each other with the familiarity of people who had been colleagues for centuries. One delegation, occupying a particularly prominent inner ring position with seats twice the size of anyone else's, drew Yara's attention not because of their appearance, but because of the way the room oriented around them. Everyone faced them slightly, the way sunflowers face the sun, not because they choose to, but because the gradient is overwhelming. The Veth Dominion. She had read about them in the archives. 12,000 inhabited systems under direct Dominion governance, founding military partners of the conclave, a history of what the official documents called civilizational stabilization operations, a phrase Yara had learned to translate from euphemism in her first year as a prosecutor. It meant, we arrived, we decided the locals were a problem, and we solved the problem. The Veth themselves resembled nothing so much as architecture given intent. They were tall, angular, their bodies encased in carapace the color of dried bone. They did not look at the outer tiers at all. During the pre-session reception, a gathering in an adjacent hall where delegates mingled, ate substances that had been carefully made safe for each species, and practiced the performance of goodwill, Yara moved through the room with her glass and her attention. She spoke to delegates from 11 different species in 4 hours. She asked careful questions and listened to what the answers tried not to say. She learned that 3 species in the mid-tier had filed formal complaints against the Veth in the past century. All 3 had, over the following decades, experienced sudden and inexplicable trade disruptions, border reclassifications, and in one case, a navigational accident involving a colony ship. All 3 had eventually withdrawn their complaints. None of them would say so directly, but the shape of it was perfectly clear. She learned that the conclave's legal office had a backlog of 600 unresolved atrocity claims, many of them decades old, catalogued and filed and quietly stagnant. She learned that the first session item the next morning was the ratification of something called the Chorus World's Administrative Integration Compact. She looked it up that night in her bunk, reading by the cold blue glow of a display that should have been dimmed. She read for 3 hours. She read every document, every annex, every reference supporting file. The Chorus Worlds had been 4 inhabited planets. Combined per-contact population, approximately 900 million people. Current population, 42 million, mostly in resettlement zones under Veth administration. The gap was labeled, in the official filing, as population restructuring losses associated with stabilization. Yara put down her display and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she opened her notes and started writing. The chamber filled slowly, the way formal places always do, delegates arriving in clusters, finding their seats, settling into the rituals of beginning. The translation systems hummed to life, filling the hall with the soft overlay of 43 languages rendered simultaneously into whatever each delegate needed to hear. The air smelled faintly of something Yara couldn't identify, a scent the station systems presumably piped in to keep carbon-based species alert, though she noticed the Veth delegation showed no sign of needing help staying awake. The session was called to order by the conclave's presiding voice, an ancient Theric named something unpronounceable whose translated title was, simply, the eldest. It moved slowly to the dais and spoke in a tone that had clearly been practiced across centuries of opening sessions. The first agenda item was the Chorus World's Administrative Integration Compact. It was presented as routine. A Veth Dominion representative rose, and even rising, they managed to convey that standing was something they were doing as a courtesy to the room's spatial conventions, not because they needed to, and delivered a 14-minute summary of the compact's terms. Resettlement framework, resource management protocols, integration timeline extending 60 years. The language was precise, bureaucratic, and almost hypnotic in its normality. Several delegates in the middle tiers were visibly following along on their own documentation, nodding at familiar formulations. Yara sat absolutely still and listened to 42 million survivors being administered. The presiding voice opened the floor for comment. A mid-tier species offered a minor amendment regarding resettlement zone naming conventions. It was accepted. A second species asked a procedural question about reporting timelines. The Veth answered it with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. The atmosphere was cooperative, practiced, efficient. The texture of a process that had been done before would be done again, and was simply how things worked. When the vote came, it moved outward from the inner ring. Yes, 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 abstain, yes, yes, abstain, yes. It reached the outer tiers. Speaks carefully of the Murath delegation caught Yara's eye for just a moment, a warning, or perhaps an apology, and then cast her abstention in the soft, practiced way of someone who had learned that abstention was the safest shape silence could take. The vote reached Section 41, Row 7, Outer Tier. Earth Observer Status, Non-Binding Participation. Yara pressed the button marked No. The translation systems rendered it into 43 languages simultaneously. The display at the central dais updated in real time. In the inner ring, one of the Veth turned not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow certainty of something that was not accustomed to needing to look, and faced the outer tier. The chamber did not gasp, it did something worse. It went completely, absolutely, structurally silent. The silence of a room that has not heard that sound in so long it has forgotten what it means to hear it. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware that the air has stopped moving. The presiding voice recovered first. It noted, in a tone carefully stripped of expression, that the motion carried with 41 affirmative votes, 1 abstention, and 1 dissenting vote from the Earth delegation. It noted that observer status votes were non-binding. It moved to the next agenda item. But no one in that room was listening to the next agenda item. They were all, in their various anatomies and cognitive architectures, experiencing the same thing. The sudden, visceral realization that a new species had just walked into the oldest room in the galaxy and voted no like it was the simplest thing in the world. Because for Yara Osei it was. She had spent 19 years in rooms where the powerful called murder something else. She knew exactly what a yes vote in this chamber meant, and she knew what a no vote cost, and she had made her calculation before she ever left Earth. She uncapped her pen, a physical pen, ink on paper, a human affectation she'd never abandoned, and moved to the next item on her own agenda. She had a lot of work to do. They came to her that evening, the way they always do, not publicly, not formally, but in the softly lit side corridors of the station where the official record didn't reach. First it was a Tharic aide, a young one by their standards, who explained with genuine kindness that observer-tier delegates traditionally used abstentions to signal disagreement, and that a formal no vote, while technically permissible, created friction in the chamber's working relationships. Yara thanked him and asked him to spell friction in the original Tharic so she could look up its etymology later. Then it was a mid-tier delegate, the Kessin, a bipedal species with iridescent skin and a reputation for careful neutrality, who explained that the chorus world situation was extraordinarily complex, that the historical context required nuance, that Yara was new and could not yet fully appreciate the delicate equilibria that the conclave maintained. Yara asked him how long he had known about the population figures. He left without answering. Finally, just before midnight station time, a Veth representative came. Not the delegation leader, not yet, but a senior aide, whose name translated to something like instrument of policy. It sat across from her in the small meeting room she'd been given, and it looked at her the way very powerful things look at small new obstacles, with patient, architectural contempt. It told her, in careful and pleasant language, that humanity was young. That young species benefited from guidance, that the conclave's norms existed because interstellar civilization required stability, and stability required trust, and trust required that new members not destabilize processes that had functioned for millennia. It told her that humanity had colonies, 11 of them, young and widely spaced, in regions of space where navigation was complex, and accidents were, historically, more common among species who had not yet built relationships with established powers. It did not say, "Withdraw your objection or something will happen to your colonies." It didn't need to. The shape of the threat was a grammar Yara had learned to read in her first years as a prosecutor. The threat that announces itself through its own absence, that leaves the space where the words would be and trusts you to fill it in. She waited until it finished. Then she opened her document case and removed a physical folder, again, ink and paper, something that seemed to unsettle every alien species she'd encountered in a way she found quietly useful, and placed it on the table. "I've prepared a filing," she said. "Under Section 7, Article 14 of the Conclave's Judicial Protocols, the War Crimes Evidentiary Submission Clause. I'd like to walk you through the structure since you'll be seeing it formally tomorrow morning." The filing was 4,012 pages. It included intercepted Veth internal communications obtained through human intelligence, assets the Conclave security apparatus had no record of. It included survivor testimonies, recorded, translated, sworn from Chorus World survivors, gathered through a relay network that humanity's diplomatic advance team had quietly built over the 14 months between Earth's first FTL flight and Yara's departure. It included orbital sensor data, cross-referenced against the Veth's own submitted timelines, demonstrating conclusively that the stabilization event had proceeded in 3 deliberate phases, targeting civilian population centers in sequence. It did not call the events complex. It did not describe them as administrative losses. It called them what they were: a deliberate extermination campaign conducted against 4 inhabited worlds, carried out by the Veth Dominion, documented in the Dominion's own files, and ratified into legitimacy by a conclave that had spent 40 years choosing not to look at the evidence. The Veth aide looked at the folder for a long time. "You understand what you are doing," it said finally. It was not a question. "Yes," Yara said, "do you?" She had spent 19 years learning that the most dangerous thing you could do to power was make it say the quiet part out loud. Not because it would destroy itself, power rarely did that, but because once the quiet part was spoken, everyone in the room knew what had always been true, and some of them could not unknow it. The aide left without the folder. Yara kept it because she had 17 more copies, The news reached Earth on a Friday, which meant every time zone had a full news cycle to process it before the weekend. The Veth Dominion's threat, delivered through intermediaries, technically unofficial, but leaked in its entirety within 6 hours by a human intelligence officer who had apparently decided that plausible deniability was a concept that didn't survive contact with 900 million dead, landed in human media with the particular velocity of a thing people had been half waiting for. The headline that ran on the most read news service in the world was simple: "Alien Empire threatens human colonies. Our diplomat won't back down, should she?" The debate that followed was not simple. Yara had expected it. She had, in fact, planned for it, had recorded 3 different video messages for 3 different outcomes, and sent them to her chief of staff with instructions for which to release when. What she hadn't planned for, what no calculation could have prepared her for, was the chorus world's survivors. 42 million people, administered into resettlement zones, had for 40 years communicated through channels the Veth controlled. The Veth filtered what left those zones the way rivers filter what reaches the sea, comprehensively. But humanity's advanced intelligence team had, quietly, built an independent relay. And when Yara's filing went public, when the testimony transcripts were released, the survivors had, for the first time in 4 decades, a way to speak that bypassed Dominion filters. They used it. The transmissions were not polished. They were not formatted for media consumption. They were people, physically different from humans but recognizably, devastatingly people, sitting in gray resettlement corridors, holding photographs of cities that no longer existed, speaking directly into cameras about what had happened to their families during the stabilization events. The translations were imperfect. The syntax was alien. And it didn't matter at all, because grief translates perfectly, and the expression of someone who has lost everything has exactly the same shape in every species that has ever had something to lose. Earth watched for 72 hours almost without pause. The governments that had been urging Yara to stand down went quiet, not because they had changed their strategic calculus, but because the political cost of saying we should let this go had just become unquantifiable. Parliaments that had been preparing formal recall requests for Yara's credentials shelved them. The Prime Minister of the East African Union, whose Foreign Policy Office had drafted a careful memo about the risks of antagonizing founding conclave members, instead addressed her citizens with 7 words that became, within hours, the most shared phrase in human history. "We have seen, we will not look away." Military assets that had already been quietly repositioned, a decision made 6 weeks before Yara's departure by a defense counsel that had read her briefing on Veth historical behavior and drawn their own conclusions, were confirmed in their new coordinates. 11 young colonies, spread thin across uncertain space, went to elevated readiness without fanfare. And Yara Osai, in her outer-tier seat in a chamber that was watching her with the combined weight of 43 civilizations' worth of anxiety, received a single encrypted message from her chief of staff. It contained no text, just a timestamp and a news link. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what it said. Humanity was not standing down. She had never really believed it would. Not because humans were fearless. They were not, she was not. Her hands had been very slightly unsteady through the entire meeting with the Veth aide, but because humans had a particular relationship with injustice that other species seemed not to fully understand. They had spent their entire history doing terrible things to each other and then, crucially, arguing about it. Loudly, endlessly, across generations. They had developed entire systems, laws, courts, truth commissions, journalism, art, specifically designed to force a reckoning with what the powerful did to the powerless. They had not yet learned to stop applying those systems when the powerful happened to have ships that could cross between stars. That, Yara thought, was the thing the conclave had not read in the briefing materials. The conclave's founding charter was 9,317 pages long. This was not unusual for documents of its age and significance. The Theric legal tradition favored comprehensive language, believing that ambiguity was the hiding place of future injustice. What was unusual was that, in 11,000 years of operation, no one had read all of it in preparation for using it against a founding member. Yara had a team of 5 human legal scholars who had been living aboard an Earth Deep Space Research Station for the past 8 months, specifically reading conclave legal archives, and 2 alien legal experts who had agreed to help for reasons they each stated differently, but which all amounted to, "I have wanted someone to do this for a very long time." On day 4 after the filing, they found it. Section 44, Article 9, Subsection 3(c) of the Founding Charter, inserted at the insistence of a species called the Velhari, who had been among the conclave's original framers and who had gone extinct approximately 6,000 years ago. The Velhari had apparently witnessed, in their own era, a founding member atrocity that the new conclave had moved to quietly bury, and they had insisted on a mechanism that could not be easily closed. An emergency tribunal clause, activatable without the approval of the presiding voice, without inter-ring consensus, requiring only 3 co-signatory member states to file a joint petition for formal war crimes tribunal proceedings, a petition that, once filed, created a legal obligation for the conclave to convene, because the charter language was absolute, shall convene, not may consider. It had never been used. The Velhari had been extinct for 6 millennia. Everyone who might have remembered this clause had either forgotten it or learned not to remember it. Yara spent 71 hours in the outer tier corridors. She did not make speeches. She did not threaten. She carried a single 2-page summary document, and she sat with delegates in their small station-issued rooms, drank whatever they offered, and asked them to tell her their own histories first. Because she had learned, in 19 years, that people who had been afraid for a long time needed to be heard before they could be brave, and that the bravery didn't come from outside. It came from the recognition that someone else was willing to stand in the same place you'd been standing alone. The Murath delegation signed first. Speak carefully pressed her mark to the document with steady hands and said nothing, but her eyes held the particular brightness of someone setting down something very heavy. Then the Hevari, then the Ossian Collective, then 7 more species from the outer and middle tiers, some of whom had their own buried grievances against the Veth, some of whom had no grievance at all except the simple, clarifying fact of the testimony footage that had reached even conclave delegates through Yara's relay. 11 signatures, 3 were required. She filed the petition at 300 station time on day 5, through the conclave's formal legal intake system. The system, which had not processed an Article 9 filing in its entire operational history, flagged the submission as an anomalous document type and routed it to a junior archivist who had been on duty for 6 hours and was deeply confused. By morning, the conclave's senior legal office had confirmed its authenticity. By afternoon, the inner ring knew. By evening, the Veth Dominion called an emergency session of the inner circle, a meeting Yara was not invited to, but whose outcome she had already modeled in 4 different scenarios on a whiteboard in her bunk. In every scenario, they had only a few options, and none of them were good. The Veth Dominion withdrew from the conclave on a Wednesday. It was announced formally, through the proper channels, in the correct legal format because the Veth were, above all, a civilization that understood the importance of form. 6 allied species went with them, some under economic pressure, 2 apparently genuinely ideologically aligned. The inner ring lost nearly a third of its permanent members overnight. The station's operational funding dropped by 31%. 3 ongoing conclave peacekeeping missions were thrown into uncertainty. The session hall, when it reconvened, had the disoriented quality of a room that has been rearranged while people were sleeping. The inner ring had visible gaps. The light distribution, calibrated for the original seating geometry, landed wrong, cold blue where it should have been amber, shadows in places that had always been lit. The presiding voice opened proceedings with a statement describing the situation as unprecedented and calling for measured deliberation. Several mid-tier delegates called for a pause in tribunal proceedings to allow for diplomatic re-engagement with the Veth. Yara let them speak. She had learned that you let the room exhaust its fear before you asked it to use its courage. Then she stood from the outer tier, row 7, section 41, and said quietly that the tribunal had a legal obligation to proceed, and that if the conclave paused it now, under this pressure from this actor, they would be announcing to every species watching that the founding charter's guarantees were contingent on whether the accused found them convenient. The room again went silent. This silence was different from the first one. The first had been shock. This one was recognition, the particular sound of a group of people realizing that someone has articulated exactly what they already knew and had been hopping not to say. The tribunal proceeded. 3 days later, the Veth made good on their implicit warning. 3 human colony ships in the Kaun corridor were intercepted by Veth vessels, conducting what the Dominion described as routine navigational enforcement. The Magellan Rising was boarded. Its crew, 47 people, mostly scientists and engineers, were detained for 11 hours before being released with formal apologies and no explanation. No one was hurt. It was designed not to hurt anyone. It was designed to make 47 families watch a news broadcast and feel the specific, hollow terror of understanding that their people had been held by something old and enormous and angry. Humanity's response was not loud. The defense assets that had been quietly repositioned 8 weeks before Yara's departure, 6 vessels, classified, their specifications not published, moved to the Kaun corridor in a pattern that the Veth's tactical analysts could read clearly. They did not fire. They did not broadcast warnings. They simply appeared in exactly the right positions, with exactly the right sensor signatures, and they sat there. The Veth did not intercept any more human ships. Back on the station, Yara sat alone in her bunk that night and finally sent the message she had been drafting for weeks. It went to her sister in Nairobi, who was not a diplomat, not a soldier, not a public figure, who ran a small architecture firm and had 3 children, and had sent Yara 12 increasingly worried messages in the past month. She wrote, "I don't know if I've saved anyone or started something. I don't know if being right is the same as doing right. I know the chorus world's families are alive and being heard for the first time in 40 years. I know the tribunal is moving. I know I would do it all again." She paused. "Tell the kids I'm fine. Tell them their aunt is being very professional." She pressed send, turned off the display, and lay in the dark for a long time listening to the sound of a station full of civilizations trying to figure out what came next. Part via Humanity's Mark. The tribunal verdict came 63 days after the filing. It was not a death sentence. It was not an invasion. The conclave was not, had never been, a military body capable of marching on the Veth Dominion. That was not. Yara had always understood the point. The point was the record. The tribunal issued a formal finding of systematic atrocity, the first in conclave history, against the Veth Dominion for the deliberate destruction of the chorus world's populations. It attached reparations obligations, enforceable against Veth-held resource assets in neutral space, to be administered through an independent fund for chorus world's reconstruction. It entered the complete evidentiary record, all 4,012 pages, plus 1,100 pages of tribunal proceedings, into the permanent conclave archive, indexed, accessible to every member species, irrevocable. The Veth, from outside the conclave, issued a formal statement calling the proceedings illegitimate. No one in the chamber appeared to find the statement very interesting. The Chorus World survivors were informed through Yara's relay. The response took 12 hours to reach the station because it was not a formal statement. It was footage of people gathering in resettlement courtyards across 4 worlds, standing in the gray corridors and the dusty open squares, doing nothing in particular, just standing together. Some of them were crying, some were not. One very old woman, on the largest of the 4 worlds, held up a photograph of a city that had been erased 41 years ago and stood with it for a long time, not performing grief, not performing anything, just insisting, in the most quiet and absolute way, on being seen. Yara watched it alone in her room and let herself feel it without managing it, which she almost never let herself do. In the weeks that followed, the conclave restructured. New voting protocols were proposed. Several mid-tier delegates, emboldened, submitted a comprehensive reform package that would reduce longevity-weighted voting advantages. It passed, narrowly, after 3 weeks of debate that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. The presiding voice, in a session comment that was not in the formal record but was heard by every delegate present, said that the Charter had always intended this, and that it had taken 11,000 years and a species from a small planet in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy to make the intention legible. The delegations that came to Yara's door after the verdict were different from the ones who had come before. Before, they came to manage her. Now they came with their own file folders, physical ones, she noticed, a habit spreading, containing their own buried evidence, their own old complaints, their own long silences that had calcified into something they were only now examining. She met with 17 of them. She drank substances of uncertain molecular composition in small rooms all over the station. She listened first, every time. The last meeting was with Speak Scarcely of the Murath, who had signed the petition first and said nothing when she signed it. Now she sat across from Yara in the small meeting room, the same one where the Veth aide had sat, and she was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "We have been here for 30 years, she said. "We learned to be quiet very quickly. We thought it was survival." "It was," Yara said, "for a while." "How did you decide it wasn't anymore?" Yara thought about 19 years of courtrooms. She thought about the Chorus World's footage, the gray corridors, the old woman with the photograph. She thought about 47 crew members held on a ship for 11 hours and 47 families watching the news. "We've been doing this to each other for a very long time," she said finally. "Humans, I mean. We've spent 10,000 years finding reasons why some people don't count. We got very good at it." She paused. "We also got very good at refusing to accept it. That part took longer. It never completely worked, but we kept doing it anyway." She looked at Speak Scarcely. "I think we just hadn't encountered anyone outside our own planet who needed us to do it yet." The Murath delegate was quiet for a moment. "The older species say you are a dangerous species," she said. "That you arrived too early, that you don't understand how things work." "They're right," Yara said. "We don't." She picked up her pen. "We're going to keep not understanding for a very long time.